Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Kirby 64, the Crystal Shards. In the last part we started off the game and now we're in World 2 Rockstar, which is largely a desert-themed area. They do some things with the visual themings of worlds here and again, but it more comes into play with the obstacles you face rather than any specific mechanics. Largely if there's a mechanic that's going to be unique, it's unique to the level in question, not so much a world theme. Which, to be fair, is also pretty in tone for Kirby as a series. Largely, at most, there will be a level gimmick rather than a world gimmick, so to speak, as opposed to some other 2D platformers. So for this level, one of the Crystal Shards is going to require a combo ability, and if you want to make sure you get things done on your first visit, you're going to want to either enter with or grab stone very early on in this level. You don't need to have the other half of the combo ability yet, though, because it's not available until the end of the stage anyway, but if you wanted to have it for the entire stage, which, honestly, not the worst idea, you're going to want to get Stone and Spark as a combo to actually do things around here. So let's actually start today off by reading the plot as said in the manual, because the intro cutscene did a pretty good job of telling us what's going on, but we might as well get the actual text to the situation as well. The Crystal Shards. In a distant corner of the galaxy, fairies lived peacefully on the planet called Ripple Star. But then one day, a mysterious black cloud appeared and surrounded the peaceful planet. The cloud, a sinister force known as dark matter, had come in search of the fairy's secret treasure, their shining crystal. A fairy named Ribbon knew that dreadful things would come to pass if dark matter gained control of the powerful crystal. She grabbed the shining stone and escaped from Ripple Star, just before the planet was completely engulfed. However, as Ribbon fled, 3 dark clouds split from the mass of dark matter to chase her through space. When they caught up with her and attacked, the fairy's crystal shattered into tiny shards, which dropped like falling stars onto the many planets in the solar system. Still holding one of the crystal shards, Ribbon fell onto the planet called Popstar, where, perhaps by fate, she ran smack into Kirby. After hearing her desperate plight, Kirby resolved to help Ribbon recover all of the crystal shards, and so begins Kirby's latest adventure. So yeah, Ribbon's the name of the little fairy who actively pops out of us whenever we grab a crystal star. But also, them just directly name-dropping that the villain is dark matter again actually plays into something I briefly brought up last time. Kirby 64 is effectively Kirby's Dream Land 4. And part of the reason for that is, counting Kirby's Dream Land 2 and 3, Kirby 64 completes the Dark Matter trilogy, so to speak, where Dark Matter itself is the primary antagonist. And largely is also the last time we've seen the character since, sort of. They've had some cameos and backgrounds and in posters here and again, like back in Squeak Squad. But they are given focus in specific in 2 other entries after this, Mass Attack and one of the 2 3DS games. I can't remember which of the 2 it is off the top of my head. I want to say it might be Robobop, but I actively can't recall off the top of my head. So right there is the block we actively need Rock and Spark to break, but thankfully there are some enemies that have Spark later in this screen. Admittedly, there are times where the blocks you need to actively use power combos to break and all that can really blend into the stage itself or into the background especially. Specifically, I think the last color block we need to break like that is one of the biggest cases of that, but that's not all the way until the second to last part, I believe. Largely, as long as you keep an eye out for parts of the terrain that are a solid color, striped, checkerboarded, or otherwise seem a little out of place, you'll largely be fine, but every now and then there's a crystal shard that's comparatively kind of maliciously hidden. There's like 3 off the top of my head that are just kind of in just almost dickish locations. Though something actively very helpful about this game when it comes to getting 100% is that if you miss a crystal shard, you don't need to complete the level again to save it. Say in this level I only grabbed the 2nd and 3rd crystal shard and I just had to get the first one, I could go to where it was, grab it, pause the game, and then press the try again button. That actively doesn't like reset you to a checkpoint, that sends you back to the world map. But it actively saves any crystal shards you grabbed along the way. That's just generally pretty helpful, but what really helps it in this game is that, A, like I've already mentioned last time, Kirby moves a little bit at a lackadaisical pace in his movement compared to some other games, but also, compounding that is that, while this game doesn't have as many levels as certain other Kirby games, the levels are individually a lot longer feeling in some cases. But again, a lot of that could also just be due to Kirby's movement speed. And there are ways you can move a little bit faster besides just dashing. The fire ability, especially if you stack up 2 of them, is very good for moving much more quickly across a room. But it really just depends on what abilities you want to use and all that. Be careful of areas like this, by the way, where things are moving from the background to the foreground, because they will crush you, and crushing is instant death. In fact, I want to say on an average playthrough of this game, crushing is how I die the most because of my either relative impatience or just forgetting that something's going to move in general. Although, speaking of my history of the game, let's finally talk about that. Kirby 64 is not a game I owned growing up, but I did play a lot of it still because, while I didn't own it, my cousin who lived the next town over did. And my uncle, who was her father, of course, used to babysit me decently often, especially if my parents were doing, like, some sort of work dinner or anything like that, so I would be there from, like, after school till maybe, like, 2 or 3 in the morning. And I would play the hell out of this game while I was there. The only other game I maybe played about as many times as this while I was there was Gex 3. Specifically, its N64 version, of course, considering same console and all that. And I still can't tell in retrospect if I made the right choice in one regard, because that cousin wasn't really much of a gamer. I think the N64 was about where she ended, if maybe not, like, early PS2 GameCube. But she let me take one of the N64 games home of my choice later on, because I think she was going to sell the rest of them. And I ended up taking Gex 3. I'm not sure to this day if I made the right choice in not taking Kirby 64. Because Gex 3 is probably my favorite Gex game writ large. But Kirby 64 is also really neat. When I think back, though, I'm actually not even certain if I beat this game back when on my cousin's N64. I probably got at least 3 or 4 worlds deep, but I don't recall ever seeing the final boss while there. I remember beating the game for the first time, I think, on, like, Wii Virtual Console, I want to say. Something like that, maybe around when Dream Collection was freshly announced, but I already had Kirby 64 downloaded on my Wii. And I want to say the first time I heard the final boss track specifically was through Smash Brawl's remix of it, which that would support that in my memory, but it's been long enough, heck if I entirely remember. Speaking of memory, though, something I recall having an issue with in this game growing up was depth perception. And I think that was more because I was a little kid, because honestly, even compared to some other N64 games, I think Kirby 64 is very clear about what's in the foreground and not. Especially with the angle that they'll almost always have the camera at. You can always tell where Kirby is in space relative to other things. And in that regard, they thought this game through pretty well. To the point where, obviously the game's 2.5D and there's foreground and background elements that can still damage you in some cases. But say you are spitting an enemy out to try and damage something, or to throw an ability star at an opponent to try and get a power combo going. If the level curves around an area, the ability will also curve along the main path. The game is very rigid on its track, so to speak. Every now and then in levels, we're actually going to take control of Dedede with Kirby riding on his back, and the only thing this really changes is your general controls of weight. With that said, you do also get the hammer ability from doing this, and this is the only way to do this in the game. You can use it to break down either slightly different colored walls or cracked surfaces, should there be any. With that said, these sections are pretty far and few between. But in retrospect, honestly, a pretty good basis for what they would actively use to make Dedede playable as in the more recent games over the last, like, what, 12, 15 years? Dedede is probably the most involved any of your buddies are going to get, though, because we've already seen what Adeline tends to do. Dedede does this. Waddle Dee will largely just kind of be here just to say hi here and again. Also, not for nothing, this might be my favorite Dedede model. I don't know why, there's just something about that's the right level of expressive and adorable. And I did kind of like that they kind of tried to re-proportion him in Return to Dreamland Deluxe to look a bit more like this, but I kind of felt like it was missing something. Probably the low poly nature, if I had to guess. So before we head into the next level, I don't do this in the footage, but I recommend going back to grab the stone ability to start, as the first crystal shard here requires it, and I do need to backtrack into this level due to that. With that said, backtracking to the levels in this game, as I've already mentioned, isn't too bad, on top of how easy it is to find a lot of powers in this game very quickly near the start of other stages. So, at this point, let's also start talking about this game's dev staff, as there's some pretty interesting people, familiar people for the Kirby series here in general. But in specific, I want to actually start with the director of this game, Shinichi Shimomura. His first role was as just a staff member on Hyperzone, which was also a HAL Labs game on the Super Nintendo. And moving forward, every game he was tied to was Kirby. He was a staff member for Pinball Land, and he was a level designer for Kirby's Adventure, Dream Course, and Dreamland 2. Same thing with Superstar, but he was then the director of Kirby's Dream Land 3, this, and Nightmare in Dreamland. And after that, seemingly left the industry entirely. And what's kind of wild about that, with Nintendo specifically, a lot of their directors that worked and directed some of their games, we know a bit of their history, we know what they did afterwards if they left the company to work on other games or anything like that. Shimomura, we know nothing about what happened to them after they left HAL after Nightmare in Dreamland. They seemingly just completely vanished. And honestly, in some regards, that might be a good thing. I think it's good to have records of these creatives. But at the same time, if a person wants to keep their life in private, let them keep it in private, you know? Double Fire here is one of my favorite power combos in the game, just for getting through levels, because A, it does a lot of damage. B, it has a wide hitbox. It's not just the cone, the wings at the very start of the animation actually also can do damage. But also, it just moves a lot more quickly than Kirby's main movement speed. And that can be really helpful for getting through stages really quickly, especially if you're trying to, say, get to certain places you may have missed a Crystal Shard. Speaking of which, I believe the Crystal Shard we just grabbed, you do need to fall through the holes earlier in the stage in a specific order to grab, so be careful with that. Looking at Shimomura's projects, though, does remind me of a little thing about Kirby 64, specifically that it's actually pretty consistent with the trend of a lot of the early Kirby games, in that it released pretty late in the console in question's life cycle, because I believe Dreamland 1 was a 91-92 game versus the Game Boy's release date of 89, and that doesn't even get into, like, Pinball Land, Dreamland 2, and all that. Still being on the Game Boy all the way up until, I think, like, 95, I think? Kirby 64 released in 2000 in the US and Japan, whereas I believe in Europe and Australia it came out in, like, mid-2001. 2000 was, like, the last real year for the N64 at large, because I think there were only, like, maybe 15 games released for it across 2001 off the top of my head, one of which being the original Paper Mario, and I think, like, the last game in general released in 2002, at least in terms of, like, official releases. Technically speaking, there's probably some games in homebrew type stuff that's released since then, but I'm not too in the know about that kind of stuff. Though thinking about it, Kirby 64 was probably also one of the last games for the series to really follow that trend, because Kirby got onto the Game Boy Advance almost immediately in my memory. Because I think even the lone Kirby game that was released exclusively for the Game Boy Color, which was Tilt and Tumble, I think was like 2 or so years into that handheld's lifespan. Although wait, I say that, I think the Wii Kirby games came like 4 or 5 years after the Wii's launch, so those are pretty late in that thing's lifespan too. Although not for nothing, the Wii had a pretty long lifespan, all things considered. Especially given I think there were some games that actively were releasing better on Wii than they were on Wii U for the limited lifespan of the Wii U as it was. Off the top of my head, I think this is the first level we've been able to swim in the game, and it doesn't feel great. Kirby does move left to right a bit faster in water than he does on ground, which is kind of funny, but the level of ascension you get for just mashing the A button once if you're trying to climb up areas like this, albeit we do have a current above us pushing us down a little further, can leave a little bit to be desired. With that said, we don't have to swim too many times in the game. I think at most there's maybe 4 or 5 levels you do it in across the entire game. Which admittedly, that's about the equivalent of a full world, but it's usually pretty quick whenever it happens. So now that I've grabbed that trading card, we're actually going to go back to an earlier level here in Rockstar so I can go grab the stone power-up and then head back to the level we just cleared. And just to showcase it, just like with the Crystal Shards, if you actually press pause and then click try again, not only will you retain any Crystal Shards you've gained on that playthrough of a stage like I mentioned a few moments ago, you'll also keep any abilities you've grabbed, which is pretty consistent with later games in the series, so with this, we can just leave and head back into that level, and I won't have to worry about redoing too much. Oh, actually, that reminds me. Something I haven't talked about yet is that this is actually also the first Kirby game where Kirby had a voice given to him. And he's voiced by Makiko Omoto, who has actually been the voice of him since. She's still voicing him to this day. She's also the voice of Ness in the Smash games. I think she's the Japanese voice for Verity from Kid Icarus Uprising. I think she's also the voice for Lyn in Fire Emblem whenever she gets to have one. And I think she's also Ina in Samurai Warriors off the top of my head. Generally really good at doing really adorable sounds for Kirby. Though for some reason I'm also now just picturing Kirby saying a fully formed sentence in a fully formed idea. And something about that feels wrong. Kirby's a weird little baby. He should never speak full sentences. But at the same time, they let Pikachu do that at least once, and that was also really weird. It was always a little bit weird when Mario and Luigi did that outright as well, but there's a little bit more precedence for that, if only because Charles Martinet started voicing Mario in the typing game, I want to say, so a lot more dialogue then than your average platformer as it was. And, well, now here we are with a new voice for Mario and Kevin Afghani and Chris Pratt voicing him in the movies, which... Yeah, Mario Galaxy movie looks cute. I'll probably see it at some point. Not my biggest priority. Although on that note, I don't actually remember across my Kirby LPs over the years if I've really ever talked about the anime at large. I remember watching Kirby Right Back At You a lot as a kid. But genuinely, while I remember some occasional one-off episodes, like the one where Kirby, or not Kirby, where Dedede actively like leads an animation studio of sorts, I can only remember sparse moments and the magical girl transformations they gave Kirby whenever he uses a copy ability. Like, I remember them actively leaving a ship towards the end of the show to go do the final battle, but I don't think I caught a single episode after that, I want to say. Mind you, I was just really bad about consistently watching shows on Saturday mornings as a kid, even the ones I really liked. Helps that sometimes they just got put into really bad time slots after a few episodes, so we didn't really get much of a chance to do that. I'm looking at the Mega Man Battle Network anime in specific there, as well as I believe the Star Force anime, which I think aired on TV briefly, albeit most of the dub for that was on Toonami Jetstream. For our next Crystal Shard, you're going to need Bomb and Spark as a combo, as using it turns you into a light bulb that explodes after a moment. Lighting up in that room will light up the panels that Adeline is staring at, which randomly display 3 of the sigils from this room's switches. Press them down in the correct order by pressing down the D-pad to have the Crystal Shard spawn in at the far end of it. Worth noting, should you forget what the combination is, you can go back into the room. You just need to press the switches you pressed down again, I believe. Largely, this game is pretty forgiving about puzzles like that, where you can usually just go back to the prior room and try again. But there's also sometimes they won't do that. There's one specifically infamous case in a World 4 stage, I believe? World 5? We'll get to it towards the end of the LP. So there's what happens if you actively exceed the maximum distance you can fly with Kirby in this game. He just gets tired and immediately just falls down. You can still control yourself left to right when you fall, but in most cases you're probably going to be over a bottomless pit if you're exasperating him that much, so be careful. Be careful. Admittedly, in that regard, I think some of the most stressful Crystal Shards in this game, even if they're easy to grab, are the ones that are over bottomless pits, like the one we got back in, like, I think World 1, 2. I think we got one in the first or second level in this video as well, and there's several more of them throughout the game. More just because, A, Kirby does actually have some pretty fast falling momentum in this game. But also compared to most games before and after this in the series, I feel like a single A press mid-flight sends you a lot less further upwards than it does in the other games. But that could also be a trick of the camera in a lot of cases, because in the 2D games, the camera is always directly focused on you in a way where you can get a good judge of the vertical distance. Sometimes in this game, that's not exactly the case. So, boss for Rockstar is Pix, and Pix notably actively has 2 phases like the previous boss, but phase 1 is actually more a game of avoidance than anything. We don't really actually need to attack the boss at all. Pix takes the form of 3 octahedrons, 1 red, 1 blue, 1 green. Here in phase 1, they're just going to slowly show up and then do their main attack, which is to generate a little spike out of them in certain patterns. When it's just the red one, it rotates around. When it's the red and green one, they'll rotate around while rotating themselves towards the tower, so you just kind of walk between them. And then finally here for phase 1, when the blue one shows up, they're going to move around in the circle while just moving themselves entirely up and down, not rotating. So the timing is a little bit different, but it's largely the same concept as the second part of this phase. The real, I'm not going to say nightmare, but the trouble with this fight starts in the second phase. Also, I love this boss theme. In fact, barring the world map theme, most of my favorite songs in Kirby 64, admittedly, are its boss themes. But that's largely because they're also closer in energy to the other Kirby games that aren't this one. So for phase 2, the 3 octahedrons are going to interact with us a little more directly. They'll spawn in some of these dot matrices, and then slowly rotate around the main ring while doing one of their own attacks. The blue one will rotate along its one axis, the red one across the opposite one, and then the green one will just rotate around in a circle. Which I believe is actively directly a comment on not only the RGB values of screens, but also the RGB values usually assigned to the 3 axes in 3D modeling. Albeit, if memory serves, it's a little bit different than that, because I think in 3D modeling, green's usually the Y-axis, not the Z-axis, whereas its rotation here would definitely mean it's more of a depth thing. So worth noting, the dot matrices around the area, they come in the 3 colors of Pix itself. If you use a dot matrix that's the same color as the Pix portion you're hitting, it'll do more damage than if you hit one that it wasn't. So blue will do more damage against blue, red against red, green against green. I think it does roughly the equivalent of 2 hits of the other colors. So that's overall the fastest way to beat this fight if you don't bring in a copy ability, which I didn't for this fight. Largely, I would recommend that for bosses, with the only exception being the boss of World 5 for reasons. I think other attacks this phase can have is, I want to say they can drop little bombs across the field, which I think go largely on the larger tiles on the ground. as well as just rotating around all three in a circle that you kind of have to jump through. That's probably the hardest attack to dodge in the boss fight at large, though. And that's Pixton, a bit of a slower fight compared to Wispy Woods. But trust me, there's longer boss fights in the game at large, and we'll get to them towards endgame. Let's see how Kirby and crew leave Rockstar behind for our next world. That Kirby face is one of my favorites. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 3, we're tackling Aquastar. See you guys then.